Alright, gonna do chapter 3 out of from the fall of Hong Kong to defeated Japan. Chapter 3, the Royal Rifles. By June 1940, as we were emerging from our recruit training, Canada's war effort had shifted into high gear, and tens of thousands of Canadians were entering Canada's Army, Air Force, and Navy. New recruits were pouring into hastily built our converted barracks or tent camps from Halifax to Vancouver to begin their training. The quartermaster stores at Wolseley Barracks were busy issuing the horde of newcomers with mounds of stuff: boots, coveralls, uniforms, mess kits, blankets, web equipment, kit bags, gas masks, and rifles. The barracks was being explained, and administrative buildings everywhere were being converted into living quarters for the recruits who were arriving every day. Canadian industry was gearing up and hiring workers to manufacture the meanly unified and urgent requirements of Canada's armed forces. Shipyards were full of the concentrate of the Navy requirement for boats and ships of every kind. Our factories were tooling up and beginning to produce the heavy equipment and the moorings rings for our rapidly growing armed forces. Planes, guns, tanks, trucks, and every kind of armament were under construction. Ammunition factories were being built and running on 3 shifts. The garment industry and the manufacturers of footwear were pouring out the military clothing required. Our farmers increased their planting and their output of farm products to meet the growing demand for food for both domestic and foreign competition. The oppression and the unemployment of awful 1930s was yielding rapidly to the thousands of new orders and contracts issued by the government to civilian suppliers and every industry to meet military demands for everything from airplanes, propellers, to surgical instruments. The unemployment rolls began to fall as fast as the mercury in Winnipeg in January. Workers were needed everywhere. Our miners were working 3 shifts to keep up the output of our smelters and furnaces, increasing. The railways were hiring workers, increasing rolling stock, and starting at the seams around the clock to transportation this mass of material and humanity to its military destinations. Canadians of all ages, skills, and walks of life were enrolled in this powerful patriotic surge of national will to meet the challenge of the war in Europe. Uncle George, well too old for active service, became an officer in the Air Force as a flight instructor. Uncle Ronald became a recruiting officer. A Home Guard was formed, made up of World War I veterans, to guard important military installations and infrastructure such as the locks and canals from saboteurs. The biggest city, the smallest hamlet, the most modern farm, and every Canadian family felt the aquatic pulse. the urgency and the revelation of Canada gritted herself for the coming struggle against the Axis powers. When the incredible shortage of manpower was felt, Canadian women by the hundreds of thousands donated overalls, wrapped their curls in bandanas, entered the factories and picked up the tools of the former workers who were out in the armed forces, met their production schedules, and often did so on 3 shifts without a murmur of complaint. Our women even learned how to fly 4-engine bombers and to release pilots for combat jobs, ferried them across the ocean to Britain themselves. Every church and social club organized its members not otherwise engaged to knit socks and sweaters for the soldiers overseas. Also, Barracks was in there with National Trade of Exeter, the square, and needed the neighborhood burner to the curtain of large foot boots and the command. Drafts of soldiers came and went to fill the needs of the expanding army. One day, in the midst of the organized hubbub, I was summoned to the office of the regimental sergeant major at Holsey. This random sergeant veteran was his metal ribbons and his brass-striped cane was regulated in rank as only slightly below God. The RSM slim booked to morals like us, but when he died, he did. We listened. As I stood at attention in front of his desk, he informed me that tomorrow in Part 1 I orders I would find out that I had been promoted to Lance Corporal. After a pause to let this sink in, he said a few words of encouragement and the interview was over. The next day the orders were posted and unfilled hazing from my friends began. No more fatigues for me. Now I am a non-commissioned officer. The lowest on the totem pole is true, but noted I was an NCO. I was assigned to a sergeant instructor as a grafter assistant and apprentice. Within another 2 months or so, I was again appointed, this time to corporal. First, I was given a recruit squad to teach them front drills, which was the base for all recruit training. Then I began to be allowed to teach more interesting subjects, such as the use of the Burn light machine gun. I received a big raise in pay and I was earning $1.75 a day. That's slave labor! Whoa! By now I was nearly 18, 6'4" and 200 pounds. I had been a quick learner and, despite my age, was learning much of what I needed to know. Be an infantry instructor. I soon became a specialist of the brain gun and could do the wonderment of the squad set up opponent in seconds. These were happy and innocent times. Now I really was a member of the first team, a corporal infantry instructor at 18. Now, wow, I was on my way The summer of 1948 was a blissful period in my young life. I had a car, an ancient Grim Page, I bought for $50. I drove it home for my period of leave and lured it over my friends who were still in high school. My officers regarded me as a calmer. I was just what they wanted. Big, strong, quick to learn, conscientious, loyal, and observant. From my point of view, I was a member of a close-knit family where I was wanted and appreciated, and where, in my role, I was a star performer. My mother would have been proud of me, as my length of service and my level of learning increased, so did my self-confidence. I learned that the men under me would ignore my youth if I was prepared to do myself what I was expected of them. I also learned that careful preparation, fairness, and interest in the personal life of each soldier were the keys to gaining their cooperation. However, it didn't always work out as smoothly as I wished. One of my blood spurs occurred in the crowded main parade square at Wolseley Barracks as the commanding officer approached from the left of the marching squad. I ordered eyes right, of course. The friends obeyed me and smartly looked to the right, away from the colonel. It was a long time before I heard the last of the embarrassing mistake. At the end of September, I was summoned again by the RSM. He informed me that I was to be promoted to sergeant and was to be posted immediately to the Royal Rifles of Canada. He issued me with my orders and my travel warrants, and I left the next day. At the time, two other outstanding young corporals and instructors from Wolseley Barracks were sent to Royal Rifles, Red Batty and Rob Clayton. Bob was nicknamed Flash for some of his explosive while on leave, and was one of the founding rockets of the regiment. Both were promoted to sergeant. Red Batty was killed in action in Hong Kong, and Bob Clayton was severely wounded. Both of these men were wonderful soldiers. Bob Clayton survived his wounds and returned home, and he became a leader and inspiration to his fellow Hong Kong veterans. Bob was in St. Stephen's Hospital during the Japanese attack on the hospital on Christmas Day 1941, was forced to watch the horrible executions that the Japanese committed in St. Stephen's, including the bayoneting of 70 helpless, bedridden, wooden patients and the rape of murder of the nursing staff. The Royal Rifles was an infantry regiment with its headquarters in Quebec City. The regiment had been mobilized in July of 1940 and needed of additional sergeant instructors. The Royal Rifles of Canada was one of the oldest Canadian regiments in existence, having been founded in Quebec in 1862 at... But Canada wasn't even a country then! That was actually the British. Okay. And called the Central Rifles Battalion in 1877. The name was changed to 8th Battalion Rifles and leader in 1920. Its name was changed again to the Royal Rifles of Canada and Military Radios as well. So actually, this was established in 1922, not the 1800s. This book sometimes tells lies. Model brilliant, able, willing. The regiment had a long, proud history of serving to Canada. It had served in the South African Boer War, and it was a Boer War in 1899. Its battalion honors were Wood Road 1, including Ypres, Farntorns, Mount Shawn, and Summons, Errors, as Canadian Corps flight at the Battle of France. The Royal Rifles were in the thick of the battles. The men of the garrison were recruited from eastern townships, Quebec, the Gaspé Peninsula, the Maritimes. Many were farmers, fishermen, lumberjacks, paper makers, and miners. They held long residence as sport hunters and fishermen and been exposed to firearms from the early childhood. They were used to hard work and life in the open. They were tough as nails. They were excellent material for the army. Once you were accepted by them and understood their point of view and the sense of humor, they were wonderful to be with. They were generous, full of fun, given little thought to tomorrow, and they made great soldiers. They never lost their rituals protective and never failed to provoke fun at the enemy. Its bureaucracy and its rituals. English was the official language used in the regiment, but many of the officers and men were of French origin and were bilingual. The officers of the regiment were all from the same area, and many of the senior officers, highly experienced veterans who had served in France with the Canadian Corps from 1914 to 1918. Such officers as Hope, Prince, Young, Bishop, Early, and others gave their fine, highly experienced combat veterans of the great Canadian Army of World War I. Regimental Sergeant Burrell Sor, a senior non-commissioned officer from the British Army in World War I, was an outstanding RSM and a watchful eye on the legs of Clayton and McDowell. They were something about Shore that courting every known, especially a junior officer, with a group of fine officers. These citizen soldiers I selected to become a member of their team. From now on, I had a new family to belong to as I was a step closer to the war. I provided by train to Sussex, New Brunswick, where the Royal Rifles were quartered in new barracks and just beginning their training. I reported to the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Home, M.C., who had served as a rifleman in the regiment in World War I in France. He welcomed me and assigned me to D Company, number 18 platoon. He told me that D Company had to mount the camp guard on Monday morning, and that my first assignment was to prepare the guard for regiment and something is important at this camp. By this time, it was 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. I remember asking, "Sir, do you mean next Monday morning? 2 days from now?" He replied, "Yes." I then asked if that company of 120 men had ever formed a guard before, to which he answered, "No." This commanding that asked if I had more questions, to which I saluted and replied, "No, sir." That I then departed in haste to find Major Parker, who looked upon me as his savior, sent from high in the very neck of time to help him prepare for the guard mounting on Monday morning. The training started the next morning at 7 o'clock on the parade square in the rain. By 7 o'clock on Sunday night, I had done all I could with my company. Ready or not, we were going to conduct the guard mounting ceremony on Monday morning. As an instructor from Ontario, I made quite a sensation, and the RCR, all drill movement cutting 12 inches off the ground and cutting beside the left heel. A new company regiment, the writers of the ever saw my rebel soul, Gothic boots, the part on. They immediately referred me amongst themselves the cooler fellow. They said that if I ever misjudged the movement, I shear off linked ankle and be charged with committing a self-injury wound. On Monday morning, they did quite well, and I learned far better than expected that the junior officer guard in the Sussex, arriving at RCMSO in Kentville, Nova Scotia, qualified. I was now the youngest sergeant in the Canadian Army. I learned well in New Brunswick just now, thought, soon as the next regiment in Newfoundland, guiding aside. This is the end for chapter 3. And this book is good, but some of it is not true. Like, Canada was not even a country in 1821. We were still under the British Empire. But I think the veterans were fighting in World War I, World War II to be free. This marks the end of day 3 of 11 Days of Remembrance.